The highway patrol officer who first arrived at Pine Creek Cemetery that February morning in 2014 had seen
Get
a lot
out
of
of my
strange things
house!
in 22
Not
years on
until
the
we
job.
get what we came
He had
for.
worked floods
Hand
and
it over, old
fires
lady.
and the kind of
This is
accidents that
serious.
made
We
a
must
man go
stick to the
home and hold
plan.
his kids
I
a little
understand.
tighter.
We're with you.
But he had never
No
seen
mistakes.
anything like this. He had come because of the noise. The sound started at dawn, low and distant, like thunder that forgot to stop. By 7 in the morning, it had become something else entirely. Something that vibrated in your chest cavity and made the windows of every house in Pine Creek rattle in their frames. By 8, it was so loud that Marvella Hutchins, who was 83 years old and nearly deaf in both ears, woke up and walked to her front window and stood there with her hand pressed flat against the glass, feeling the vibration move through her palm like a living thing. The officer stood at the entrance to the cemetery and tried to count. He stopped at 500 because counting stopped making sense after that. The procession stretched back along Route 9 as far as he could see a column of chrome and black leather that disappeared around the curve of the mountain like a river with no visible source. Motorcycles. Hundreds of them. Then more. Then more still. He got back in his cruiser and called dispatch. How many, the dispatcher asked. He looked out the windshield at the sea of machines filling the cemetery road, spilling onto the grass lining the shoulders of the highway in both directions. All of them, he said. I think all of them came. He was not entirely wrong. 3,000 motorcycles came to Pine Creek, Colorado that Saturday morning to bury a woman most of the world had never heard of. They came from California and Utah and Arizona and Nebraska and states further than that. They came in clubs and alone and in groups of 2 and 3 old men with white beards and young men with new tattoos and everything in between. Rival clubs that would ordinarily not be caught dead within 50 miles of each other rode side by side with their flags lowered. None of them were asked to come. All of them came anyway. The woman they came to bury was 91 years old. She had never ridden a motorcycle. She had never been to a rally or a run or a clubhouse in her life. She stood 5 feet 2 inches tall, weighed less than 120 pounds, and spent her mornings in a rocking chair that had been carved by hand from a white oak tree long before she died. Her name was Clara Mae Jefferson. And this is the story of what she did in a blizzard in the winter of 1997 that made 3,000 men ride through a February morning to tell her goodbye. To understand Clara, you have to understand the land. Pine Creek sits at just over 8,000 feet elevation in the Colorado Rockies, the kind of place where summer is a rumor and winter is a promise that always keeps itself. The town has one gas station, one diner, one church, and a post office that is only open 3 days a week. The surrounding mountains are brutal and beautiful in equal measure, landscape that either breaks a person or forges them into something harder than they started. There is no middle outcome in country like this. Clara's father, Elias Dupree, arrived in Colorado in 1919 with $40 in his pocket and a letter of introduction to a rail company foreman who may or may not have still worked there. Elias was 24 years old, the son of a Georgia sharecropper, and he had decided somewhere between Chattanooga and Memphis that he was done being owned by other people's land. He wanted his own. Mamon. He was going to get it the only way available to a black man in America in 1919, which was to work until his body threatened to give out and then work some more. It took him 11 years. In 1930, Elias Dupree paid cash for 47 acres of mountain land outside Pine Creek, a parcel that nobody else wanted because it was steep and cold and hard to farm and a long way from anywhere. He built a cabin on it with 2 other men he had worked the rails with, and he planted a garden in the rocky soil, and he looked at what he had made and called it good. Clara was born in that cabin in 1923. She grew up knowing that the land under her feet had been paid for by her father's hands and her father's sweat and 11 years of work that had bent his spine and grayed his hair before its time. She grew up knowing that the land was not just property. It was proof. Proof that a man who started with nothing could build something that lasted. Proof that what was earned and paid for could not simply be taken away. She married Walter Jefferson in 1951 in the small white church at the edge of Pine Creek on a Saturday afternoon in October when the aspens had turned gold and the air smelled like wood smoke and coming cold. Walter was a carpenter from Denver, a quiet man with enormous hands and a way of looking at things as though he was always calculating what they were made of and whether they would hold. He looked at Clara the same way. He looked at her and decided she would hold. He was right about that, as it turned out. Walter and Clara spent 41 years together in the cabin that Elias had built. They made it larger and stronger over the decades, adding to it the way you add to something you intend to keep. Walter built the stone fireplace that would heat the place through 40 Colorado winters. He built the porch that faced the mountains and the root cellar that kept them fed through the months when the roads were impassable. He reinforced the foundation twice, working with the mason's knowledge his father had given him, setting oak beams on concrete pilings and driving steel brackets into the north wall, where the cold came hardest. He built the rocking chair from a white oak that had fallen in a storm, shaping it over 3 months with a spoke shave and a draw knife until it fit Clara's body exactly, until it was made for her and no one else. He built everything to last. Walter died in the autumn of 1992, 5 years before the blizzard. He died in his own bed, looking out the window at the mountains he had looked at every morning for 41 years, and Clara held his hand and did not look away. After Walter, the quiet came. It came the way cold comes into an old house, not all at once, but gradually finding the gaps and the thin places settling in until it felt like it had always been there. Clara was 69 years old when Walter died, and she was not a woman built for self-pity, but the silence of a house where someone used to be is its own particular weight, and she carried it every day. She managed the property herself. She caulked the windows and replaced the shingles and kept the pipes from freezing and chased the coyotes away from the garden with a shotgun that had belonged to her father. She was small and she was aging, and her hands had begun to tremble when the barometric pressure dropped, but her spine was still straight and her eyes were still clear, and she knew every inch of her land in the way you only know something you have truly fought for. She was not under any circumstances leaving. The letter arrived on a Monday in December of 1997, 3 days before the blizzard. It came in a county envelope, official and cream-colored, with the seal of Pine Creek Municipality on the upper left corner. Clara set her coffee down and opened it at the kitchen table, reading it once through without expression, and then once more. It was a condemnation order. The language was bureaucratic and dense, full of subordinate clauses and legal references, but the meaning was simple enough. Gerald Whitmore, the mayor of Pine Creek, had determined that the Jefferson property at 4471 Mountain View Road was structurally unsound and posed an imminent safety hazard. A county inspector had assessed the property and found critical foundation damage consistent with a chronic water infiltration. The cabin was condemned. Clara had until the 15th of December to vacate. The 15th was 2 days away. Clara read the letter a third time. She had lived in this cabin for 74 years. She had been born within 30 feet of where she was sitting. The foundation that Gerald Whitmore's inspector claimed was compromised had been laid by her father and 2 other men who had worked the rails and knew something about making things that stayed put. Walter had reinforced it twice. Clara knew the sound of this house in every season. She knew its creaks and its silences and the particular way it settled in the deep cold. She knew there was nothing wrong with it. She also knew why Whitmore wanted it. Gerald Whitmore had been the mayor of Pine Creek for 9 years. He was a man in his mid-50s who had grown up in Denver and moved to Pine Creek after making enough money in commercial real estate to want somewhere scenic to spend it. He dressed well and spoke smoothly and had a talent for making self-interest sound like civic duty. He had been talking for 3 years about bringing a luxury ski resort development to Pine Creek, about what it would mean for the local economy, about cuisine and tourism and the future of the town. The development he was proposing would require, among other things, the Jefferson property. Clara had told his representative, a young man in a rental car who had driven up the mountain 2 months ago, with papers and a rehearsed smile, exactly what she thought of that proposition. She had been polite about it. She had offered the man coffee. She had listened to his presentation. And then she had told him that her father had bought this land with the wages of his own labor, and that she and her husband had built their life on it, and that it was not for sale at any price, and she would like him to leave now. He had left. She had thought that was the end of it. The condemnation order told her it was not. She looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she reached for the envelope again and tipped it upside down over the table. Something slid out that she had not noticed before. A rectangle of heavy cream paper. She unfolded it. It was a check. Gerald Whitmore's signature was at the bottom, written with a fountain pen in dark blue ink. The amount line was blank. The memo line read, "Final offer." The message was clear enough. He was giving her one last chance to name her price before the machinery moved. Clara sat very still for a moment. She thought about her father standing on this land in 1930. She thought about Walter as setting the first beam of the foundation with his father's level and his father's knowledge in his own hands. She thought about 41 years of mornings looking at the same mountains from the same porch. Then she stood up, carried the check to the fireplace, and held it to the flame until it caught. She watched it burn down to a black curl of ash in the grate. She went back to the kitchen and finished her coffee. That was not, however, the end of what she did that day. She went to the small desk in the corner of the bedroom, the one where Walter had kept his carpentry invoices and she had kept the household accounts. She sat down and opened the drawer and took out a legal pad and a pen. For the next 2 hours she wrote. She wrote in her careful schoolteacher's hand, the hand she had developed in the 50s when she taught reading at the elementary school in town for 11 years before the school board decided they no longer required her services, and she understood that decision for what it was and went home and never mentioned it again. She wrote about Gerald Whitmore. She wrote about the representative who had come to her door and what he had said and what she had told him. She wrote about the condemnation order and the inspector who had been there for 5 minutes and had not gone in the cellar. She wrote about what she knew of Whitmore's development plans and the conversations she had overheard at the diner over 3 years and the things that Marvella Hutchins had told her about what was being said at the county utility meetings and the things that Pete Granger at the gas station had mentioned about the surveyors who had come through in the spring. She organized it carefully. She cross-referenced the dates. She attached copies of the documents she had kept because Clara Mae Jefferson had been keeping copies of things since 1952 and had never thrown a paper away in her life. She put it all in a large envelope. She addressed it to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Denver field office. She walked it down to the mailbox at the end of the service road in the cold December afternoon and put it in with the flag up. Then she came back to the cabin and sat in Walter's rocking chair and listened to the wind beginning to build outside, and she thought, I have done what I can do. Now we wait and see what comes. What came 3 days later was the blizzard. The storm arrived the way a door gets kicked in, sudden and total and with no room for discussion. By noon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise. By 2 in the afternoon, the snow was coming sideways, driven by a wind that screamed through the pine trees and shook the walls of the cabin in steady rhythmic blows like something trying to get inside. The power went at 9 o'clock that evening. Clara had expected it. She lit the kerosene lanterns and added wood to the fire and settled into the rocking chair with a cup of tea that was already going cold, the radio dead, the phone line humming with static. The firelight moved across the log walls the way it always had, the same shadows in the same places, familiar as her own face. She was not afraid of being alone. She had been alone for 5 years and had made her terms with it. But tonight the alone felt different. There was a quality to the silence under the storm she did not entirely like, a density, as though the night outside the windows was something more than dark. She was pulling her shawl tighter when she heard it. It did not belong to the storm. The storm had its own vocabulary, the sustained howl of the wind, the crack of ice-loaded branches, the particular percussion of snow against glass. What she heard now was underneath all of that a low mechanical growl that was both familiar and entirely wrong for these conditions. An engine. More than one engine. The sound built slowly, resolving into something she recognized with a start. Motorcycles. She put down her tea and went to the window and rubbed a circle in the frost with the heel of her palm. The moonlight was breaking through the clouds in fitful intervals, and in one of those intervals she saw them. 9 motorcycles on the service road that ran along the lower edge of her property, the road that no sensible person would have been on in any weather, and let alone this one. She watched the lead bike hit a patch of ice. It went sideways without warning, the rear wheels spinning out and the whole machine going over, and the rider went down hard and the bike came down on top of him. The sound of it was audible even through the walls, a heavy metallic crash followed immediately by a cry that might have been pain or might have been something else. The remaining 8 bikes skidded to ragged stops, engines stalling, riders leaping off. Clara watched them try to lift the fallen machine. The snow was waist-deep and rising, and the wind was hitting them broadside, and they were fighting both the weight of the bike and the conditions simultaneously. 2 of them got to the downed rider and crouched over him. The others kept working at the machine. They were not leaving him. That was the thing Clara noticed first. not the leather cuts or the size of them or the patches on their backs. She noticed that not one of them was looking back toward the road or the direction they had come from. They were working on the machine, and they were staying with the man on the ground, and nobody was going anywhere without everybody. She looked at the shotgun on the wall above the mantel, the one that had belonged to Elias Dupree. 12-gauge still sound. She looked back out the window at 9 men in black leather being swallowed by a Colorado blizzard. She heard Walter's voice as clearly as if he had been standing behind the rocking chair. "You don't leave a ton out in this cold, Clara, let alone a man." She put on her wool coat and her rubber boots, and she picked up the kerosene lantern, and she went out onto the porch. The wind hit her like a wall. She was 74 years old and barely 5'2", and the cold went through her, immediately finding the spaces between her layers. And for a moment, she stood at the top of the porch steps and considered the full weight of what she was doing. Then she held the lantern up over her head and walked down the steps into the snow. The 50 yards to the service road felt like a mile. She could not see them until she was almost on top of them. They materialized out of the white wall of the storm, suddenly massive shapes in black leather, and the nearest one turned at the sound of her voice when she called out, and she saw him clearly for a moment in the lantern light. He was enormous, well over 6 feet, with a face hidden behind goggles and a bandana, and even buried in snow and exhausted, he had the physical presence of something designed specifically to take up space and not apologize for it. He shouted at her to get back inside. She told him the roads were washed out a mile back. She told him the bridge over Miller Creek was iced over and impassable. She told him that if they stayed out here, they would be frozen solid by morning. She said all of this at the top of her voice over the roar of the wind, 74 years old in rubber boots, in a wool coat, and she did not move an inch. The big man looked at the rider on the ground, who was now conscious but clearly in pain, one hand gripping his ankle. He looked at the bikes buried to their fenders in the drift. He looked back at the old woman with the lantern standing in the blizzard like she had business being there. "We got nowhere to go," he said. "I got a fire," Clara said, "and I got a barn for the bikes. Get him up." His name, she would learn later, was Rex Malone. They called him Ironclad, which she would eventually understand was less a commentary on his physical toughness, considerable as that was, than on a quality of the mind, a quality of will. But that night in the snow, he was just the large man who looked at her for a long moment with pale blue eyes above the bandana, and then turned to his men and said quietly and without drama, "Let's go." It took 20 minutes to push the 9 machines into Walter's old hay barn. Clara watched them work. They moved with a precision that surprised her, each man knowing, without being told, what the others were doing. The fallen rider kept in the center of the group, 2 men supporting him continuously, while the others worked the bikes. Nobody complained, nobody argued. They moved like a unit that had spent enough time together that the individual parts had learned to anticipate each other. When they finally came up onto the porch, the boards shook under their weight. Clara held the door, and they filed through one after another, 9 men in black leather with patches on their backs and ice in their beards, and a collective physical mass that compressed the air in the room when they entered. They stood in her living room and dripped snowmelt onto the braided rug that had been there since 1963, and they looked at her and she looked at them. The patches on their backs read, "Hell's Riders." Clara had heard the name. Everyone in the Mountain States had heard the name. She looked at them for a moment. 9 men scarred and tattooed and enormous standing in her living room in their socks after she had pointed at their boots and told them to take them off because she had just waxed the floors. They had done it without argument. All 9 of them. She pointed at the largest one, a man with a shaved head and hands the size of dinner plates, who was nearly as tall as Rex and broader. "You," she said. "What's your name, Amos?" he said. "They call me Cornerstone." "Amos," she said. "There's a wood pile out back behind the barn. Bring in enough for the night." "Yes, ma'am," Amos said, and went back out into the cold without hesitation. She pointed at the one with the red beard. "What about you?" "Doyle," he said. "Crag face, Doyle," she said. "Peel these potatoes." Doyle looked at the potato peeler. He looked at his hands, which were large and tattooed, and had most likely not peeled a potato in years. He looked at Rex with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of amusement. Rex was working very hard not to smile. Doyle took the potato peeler. The young one with the bad ankle, whose name was Callum, but who went by Drifter, Clara, sat on the sofa and elevated his foot with two stacked pillows and told him to stop trying to walk on it. She assessed the injury with her hands working carefully despite the arthritis in her fingers and pronounced it a bad sprain. "We don't have medical supplies," Rex said from across the room. "I didn't ask what you had," Clara said, already moving to the kitchen. She made a compress from a dish towel and a bag of frozen peas from the bottom of the freezer, wrapped the ankle firmly, and told Callum to keep it elevated and not to be foolish about it. Then she put the beef stew on the stove, the one she had made the previous day that was sitting in the refrigerator, and she put cornbread in the oven, and she ran her household the way she had run it for 50 years, which was to say, efficiently and without asking anyone's permission. By the time the stew was hot and the cornbread was out of the oven, the living room had changed in quality. The tension had not so much dissipated as transformed into something warmer. The men were thawing out literally and otherwise. They had spread around the room, some on the floor with their backs against the wall, some on the sofa near Callum, one or two standing near the fireplace that Amos had stacked high with fresh wood on his return from the woodpile. They ate like men who had not eaten in a long time, which may have been true. But they used the napkins Clara put out without being asked, and they said please when they wanted more cornbread, and they said thank you when she brought it. And Callum, the youngest, said ma'am to her twice without prompting, which Walter would have approved of. It was over the second bowl of stew that Rex found the letter. He had noticed the stack of envelopes on the side table when he first came in, the way he noticed most things in a room, quietly and without making it obvious that he was looking. A county seal on the top envelope stamped in red, "Final Notice." He had seen stacks like that before in his life, and he knew what they meant. He had also noticed the empty rectangle on the wall where a picture had clearly hung for a long time before being taken down. The bare space on the shelf where something had stood that was now gone. The small signs of a household selling off what it could to stay afloat. "You live here alone?" he asked. "Since my Walter passed," Clara said. "5 years now. It's a lot of land to manage." "It's my land," she said, and the way she said it closed several avenues of conversation simultaneously. Rex nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Who's trying to take it?" he asked. Clara looked at him. She had the eyes of someone who had learned to read people quickly and had rarely been wrong about what she read. She looked at Rex Malone, and she took his measure in the way she took the measure of most things, directly and without ceremony, and then she reached over and picked up the condemnation order from the table and handed it to him without a word. He read it. He passed it to Doyle. Doyle read it and made a low sound in his chest. "Eminent domain through a safety loophole," Doyle said. "They're calling it a structural hazard." "Is it?" Rex asked her. Clara looked at him with an expression that could have cut glass. "Walter built this foundation," she said. "His father was a mason. Walter knew stone, and he knew what he was doing with it. The inspector they sent was here for 5 minutes. He didn't go in the cellar. He didn't knock on a single joist. He wrote what he was told to write." Rex looked at the date on the letter. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This says vacate by the 15th. Clara looked at the calendar on the wall above the kitchen door. "That's tomorrow," she said. The word came out flat and factual, the way she said most things. Rex stood up. He was very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man in the process of making a decision. "This Whitmore," he said, "is he a brave man?" Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite contempt. "Gerald Whitmore," she said, "is a coward in a three-piece suit. He has never done a hard thing in his life when he could pay someone else to do it for him. His nephew is the sheriff." Rex nodded slowly. He looked down at the letter. "And you're here alone." "I'm always here alone," Claire said. She stood up because she was tired in the way she got tired now, suddenly and completely, and she was not going to let these men see it. She picked up the empty bowls from the table. "That's not your problem," she said. "You boys get some sleep. Storm should break by noon. You can be on your way." She went to her bedroom and closed the door. In the living room, the fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. 9 men sat in their socks in a 74-year-old woman's living room and said nothing for a while. Rex looked at the closed door. He looked at the letter still in his hand. He looked at the calendar and the date circled on it in red ink, the date that was now less than 3 hours away from becoming today. He thought about a house in Denver. He thought about a woman not unlike Clara, a woman who had worked her whole life and owned something small and real and had it taken from her by a man in a suit with lawyers and paperwork and the law arranged in his favor. He thought about himself at 26 standing on a sidewalk watching a moving truck carry away everything his mother owned because there had been nothing he could do, and he had not yet understood what nothing was worth. He understood it now. He looked at his men. Doyle was watching him steadily. Amos had come back in from the woodpile and was watching him. Callum was watching him from the sofa, his bad ankle elevated on the pillows, his young face serious. Rex looked at the closed bedroom door one more time. "We're not going to Utah," he said quietly. "Not yet." Nobody argued. Nobody had expected to. Doyle put more wood on the fire. Amos found a spot near the wall and made himself comfortable with the ease of a man accustomed to sleeping in worse places than this. One by one, the Hells Riders settled into the spaces of Clara Jefferson's living room, like water finding its level quiet and purposeful and entirely at home. The storm pressed against the windows. The fire held. Just before 2 in the morning, Doyle was near the front window when the light appeared at the far end of the service road. Two headlights sitting still in the darkness at the edge of where the road curved away into the trees. Not moving, just there, watching the cabin with its fire-lit windows and the vehicles visible in the open barn. Doyle watched the lights for a long time. Then they went out. He did not wake Clara. He went back to his spot near the wall and lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm ease by degrees, thinking about what a man who was already planning to send a bulldozer needed to know in the middle of a blizzard that couldn't wait until morning. The fire burned low and was built back up. The storm outside began almost imperceptibly to quiet. Clara Mae Jefferson slept in the bedroom her father had built in the bed that Walter had made on the land that Elias Dupree had bought with his railroad wages in 1930. She did not know yet everything that was coming, but she had burned the check in the grate, and she had opened the door in the blizzard, and she had mailed the envelope to Denver, and she had taken the measure of 9 strangers and found them in the ways that mattered most, not so different from the men she had known all her life. Men who stayed, the kind her father had been, the kind Walter had been, the kind she would find out in the morning these were too. Part 2, you don't take from a woman like that. The smell reached her before anything else did. Clara Mae Jefferson had been waking up in the same bedroom for 74 years, and she knew every smell this cabin made in every season. She knew the smell of wood smoke and coal pine and the particular dry warmth of a fire that had been burning through the night. She knew the smell of coffee, the way it moved through the house in the mornings, finding every room. This was different. This was bacon, and something sweeter underneath it. Butter and blueberries and the specific warm smell of batter on a hot griddle. A smell she had not encountered in this kitchen since Walter was alive, because Walter was the one who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, standing at the stove in his undershirt, with his enormous carpenter's hands working the spatula with improbable delicacy, flipping them at exactly the right moment with a confidence that came from 40 years of practice. Clara put on her glasses and her robe and opened the bedroom door. She stopped in the doorway. Amos Webb was standing at her stove. He was wearing Walter's apron, the one that said King of the Grill, in faded letters that Clara had never had the heart to throw away, even though Walter had been gone 5 years and the apron had just hung on its hook by the icebox ever since. Amos was 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 260 pounds, and he was wearing that apron and turning pancakes on her cast iron griddle with an attention and care that was genuinely startling to witness. The muscles in his forearms, extensively tattooed, shifted and moved with each turn of the spatula. "Morning, Miss Clara," Amos said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. Sit down." Clara sat down. She looked around the room. The living room was immaculate. The braided rug had been straightened. The sofa cushions had been put back properly. The empty stew bowls from the night before had been washed and stacked in the drying rack. The fire was burning high with fresh wood, and the wood box beside the fireplace had been filled to the top. The other men were gone. The panic came before she could stop it, sudden and cold. The thought arriving fully formed, they had robbed her and left this one to distract her while they put distance between themselves and the county line. She pushed back from the table and went to the front window. What she saw stopped the panic dead. Rex Malone was on her roof. He was up there with Doyle, both of them working with the snow shovels, clearing the massive drift that had built against the north chimney, and the section of roof above the porch overhang where the snow load was deepest. They moved with methodical efficiency, shoveling in long strokes, working from the peak down, not hurrying, but not wasting motion either. Two other men were at the barn, one replacing the hinge on the main door that had been broken since the spring of 1994, the other examining something on the exterior wall with a flashlight. And underneath the cabin, visible as a moving beam of light through the crawlspace vent, someone was down in the cold dark working their way along the foundation. Clara stood at the window for a long time and watched these men working on the home that her father had built and that she and Walter had kept for 50 years. Watched them doing it with a thoroughness that no hired hand she had ever paid had brought to any job. Watched the steam rising from their breath in the cold morning air. She went back to the table and sat down. Boss said if they claim the house is unsound, we make it sound, Amos said, sliding a plate in front of her. Stack of 3 blueberry butter on the side. My grandmother's recipe. She taught me when I was 7. Clara looked at the pancakes. She looked at Amos. Your grandmother, she said. Yes, ma'am. She lived in Alabama her whole life. Made these every Sunday morning without fail. Said you could tell the character of a man by whether he paid attention to the small things or only the large ones. He put the butter dish on the table and went back to the stove. Clara ate the pancakes. They were, she would admit, to the empty air in the general direction of wherever Walter currently resided, exceptional. Rex came in 20 minutes later, stomping the snow off his boots on the porch before entering. He was flushed from the exertion steam rising from his thermal shirt. He poured himself a coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at Clara the way he had looked at things the previous night, quietly, and with nothing performed about it. Foundation solid, he said. Walter knew exactly what he was doing. Oak beams on concrete pilings, steel brackets on the north wall. This house is built better than most permitted construction I've seen in the last decade. He paused. But somebody's been under there. Clara set her fork down carefully. What do you mean? Rex looked at her steadily. I mean somebody cut your north drainage pipe, clean cut, not a break or a crack from age. And somebody pulled the gravel away from the base of the east footing, which causes exactly the kind of water infiltration that looks on a cursory inspection like foundation damage. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the morning light was coming off the snow with a brilliance that made everything sharp. They made it look broken, she said. Rex nodded. Whoever signed that inspection report may have believed what he wrote, or he may have been told what to write. Either way, the damage was put there deliberately before the inspection took place. Clara looked at the fireplace. She thought about the envelope she had mailed to Denver. She thought about the check burning to ash. How long would it take to fix what they did, she asked. Already done, Rex said. Doyle reran the drainage pipe this morning before breakfast. We repacked the footing gravel and shored up the disturbed area. If another inspector walks in here today, they won't find what Whitmore's man found, because it won't be there anymore. Clara looked at him for a moment. Why, she asked, the single word carrying everything she meant by it. Rex drank his coffee. He set the mug down on the counter. Because you fed us, he said, and you took us in out of a blizzard when you had no reason to. And in our world, that means something. It was not the whole answer, and they both knew it, but it was the answer he gave, and Clara accepted it. She had learned a long time ago that men sometimes carried their deepest reasons in places they didn't open for strangers, and that the reasons themselves didn't always matter as much as the actions did. Walter had been that way. You learned over time to read what men did rather than what they said. She had just picked up her fork again when the lights went out, not gradually, all at once. The hum of the refrigerator ceased, and the electric light above the table went dark simultaneously, and the cabin was suddenly running on firelight and the gray winter light coming through the windows. Rex straightened immediately. Doyle, he said without raising his voice, kill the main breaker before it trips back on. Doyle appeared from somewhere in the house, already moving toward the utility panel. Rex looked at Clara. Does Whitmore control the utility board? He appointed 3 of the 5 members himself, Clara said. The other 2 do what they're told. Rex nodded. He pulled a heavy satellite phone from his vest pocket, a device that belonged in a military surplus catalog. He looked at Clara. I need to make a call, he said. There's a man in Chicago. He owes me a favor that's been sitting on the books for 4 years. I think today is the day I collect on it. Who is he? Clara asked. His name is Barnabas Croft, Rex said. They call him the Ledger. Clara raised an eyebrow. He's a lawyer, Rex said. The best I've ever watched work. He hasn't lost a case involving real estate fraud in 11 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. You think this is fraud, she said. Rex looked at her directly. I think a dead man's signature on a government document is generally considered fraud in most jurisdictions. Yes, he said. I noticed the name on that inspection report last night. I know that name from the construction trade. Frank Dawson. I made a call at 2 in the morning to someone who would know. He paused. Dawson died 2 years ago. The room was still. Then Clara said, he used a dead man's name. Rex nodded. She looked at the fireplace for a long moment. Then she looked back at Rex. Make your call, she said. He went to the window and Dale led. Within 20 minutes, 2 industrial generators had been brought in from the equipment trailer. One of the support vehicles had been towing down the road. Callum, limping but functional and determined not to show how much it hurt, directed the setup from the porch with the focused competence of someone who had done similar work in worse conditions. By the time the morning was fully established, the cabin had power again, more reliable power than before, space heaters running alongside Clara's own baseboards. Doyle surveyed the setup with professional satisfaction. Better off than when we started, he said. That was the idea, Rex said, coming back in from outside. He had been on the satellite phone for nearly an hour. Clara had watched him through the window, pacing the length of the porch in the cold, talking with the focused intensity of a man who was not asking for a favor so much as directing resources toward a specific target. Croft is coming, Rex said. He'll be here by dark. Clara looked at him. He was already working on it, Rex said. Whitmore's name had come up in something Croft had been watching for a while. He said this morning's call saved him the trouble of making one himself. That was all Rex said about it. Clara was beginning to understand that Rex Malone operated on a strict need-to-know basis, and that his assessment of what you needed to know was considerably narrower than most people's. She found she did not mind this. Walter had been somewhat similar. It was a quality she associated with men who had learned to be responsible for others and had taken that responsibility seriously. The afternoon passed in a state of suspended readiness. The bikers finished their work on the exterior of the house and came back inside. They cleaned themselves up as thoroughly as circumstances allowed and reassumed their positions around the living room, but the quality of their stillness had changed entirely. The previous evening, they had been exhausted men finding warmth. Now they were something else. They had put their leather cuts back on. They had straightened their patches and checked the things they kept in their boots and on their belts with the quiet care of men who were preparing for something specific. Clara watched them from her rocking chair. She had the shotgun across her lap, the one that had been Elias Dupree's, loaded as it always was. Doyle had noticed it when she first picked it up and glanced at Rex. Rex had given a small nod. She knows how to use it, Rex said simply. Clara had not asked him how he knew that. He had known it the same way he knew most things, by looking carefully at what was in front of him. The waiting had a particular texture, dense and purposeful. Clara had waited like this before through other difficult hours, the waiting before bad weather, when you have done everything you can do, and now it is only a matter of enduring what comes. The waiting beside a sickbed when you know the direction of things, and the only question is when. She found to her genuine surprise that she was not afraid. She was not afraid in the way she had been afraid the morning the condemnation letter arrived, that cold, helpless dread of a threat you cannot see clearly enough to calculate. That was gone. What sat in its place was something harder and cleaner. She looked at the 9 men arranged in her living room, and she thought, whatever comes up that road today, it is not coming to find a woman alone. Barnabas Croft arrived at 5:30. Clara heard the car before she saw it, the particular sound of a vehicle with chains on winter roads, deliberate and precise. The car was a silver German sedan, expensive, and it navigated the ruts the previous day's activity had left with the careful attention of a man who had not been here before and was not going to get stuck. The man who got out looked entirely wrong for the mountains. He was somewhere in his early 60s, slight, with silver-streaked hair, cut close, and wire-rimmed glasses that had clearly not been inexpensive. He wore a charcoal cashmere overcoat and leather gloves, and carried a briefcase that looked heavy enough to require the kind of deliberate carrying that Croft gave it. He made his way across the snow to the porch with the careful steps of a man who had not brought snow boots because he did not own snow boots and was not going to be stopped by that fact. Rex met him at the door. "Barnabas," he said. "Ironclad," Croft said, looking Rex over. "You look terrible. I've been on a roof," Rex said. Croft came inside and stopped. He looked around the room at the assembled Hell's Riders. He looked at Clara in her rocking chair with the shotgun across her lap. He looked at the fire and the kerosene lanterns and the comprehensive evidence of 9 large men having occupied a small cabin for the better part of a day. "Mrs. Jefferson," Croft said, removing his gloves and inclining his head with a courtesy that seemed entirely genuine. "Barnabas Croft, Ironclad, tells me you're having a pest control problem." "You could say that," Clara said. "Coffee's on the stove. Black 2 sugars. Sit down." Croft blinked. He looked at Rex. Rex said nothing. Croft went to the stove and poured his own coffee, came back, sat down at the table, and opened his briefcase. What came out of that briefcase was the product of a full day's intensive research by a man who had spent 4 decades knowing precisely which public records to request and how to read what they contained. He spread a topographic survey of Pine Creek and the surrounding land on the table, weighting the corners with coffee cups and a salt shaker, and he pointed to a blue line. It ran directly beneath the Jefferson property, entering from the north and passing through the land at a depth of approximately 200 feet before continuing south toward the valley. "That is the primary channel of the Piedmont Aquifer," Croft said. "It is a deep water formation surveyed in 1988 and again in 1993. The 1993 survey, conducted by the State Geological Office and a matter of public record, estimated the accessible yield at approximately 40 million gallons per year for a minimum of 50 years. Clara looked at the map. She looked at the blue line running beneath the meadow where she had walked every morning for decades. "That's my well," she said. "Walter dug it in 1958. Your well accesses the upper edge of the formation," Croft said. "The primary channel runs under the northern third of your property, under the meadow and the pine grove on the north slope." "What does that mean?" Doyle asked from across the room, where he had been listening with the focused attention he brought to most things. "It means," Croft said, "that 18 months ago, a California-based water development company called Pacific Aqua Corporation filed a preliminary acquisition inquiry with the Colorado Water Rights Board." He produced a document from the stack. "They are seeking to purchase extraction rights to the Piedmont Aquifer for the purpose of large-scale commercial bottling operations. The extraction rights alone," he said, looking directly at Clara, "are currently valued at approximately $40 million. The room went quiet. Clara sat with that number. She looked at the blue line under her meadow, under the stand of pines where Walter had built a bench in 1975 so she could sit and watch the mountains come alive in the mornings. $40 million, she said. "That is the current valuation," Croft said. "It will increase." "He was never going to build a resort," Clara said. "No," Croft said. "He was never going to build a resort." Clara looked at the fire. "He just needed my land gone," she said. "He needed the title cleared," Croft confirmed. "Condemned property seized for remediation costs him pennies on the dollar. He transfers the water rights to Pacific Aqua, collects his payment, and disappears to somewhere warm." He paused. "There is one additional matter." He laid another document on the table beside the map. "The inspection report that generated the condemnation order bears the signature of a licensed surveyor named Franklin Dawson Croft," said. "Mr. Dawson was a registered structural inspector in the state of Colorado for 22 years. His credentials are legitimate, and his professional reputation was solid." Rex looked up from the document. "Was he said?" "Franklin Dawson died 14 months ago," Croft said. "Cardiac arrest, Denver, November of last year. I have the death certificate here." He produced it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 40 years being prepared. He placed it beside the inspection report so that both signatures were visible at the same time. "Same hand," Doyle said from across the room. He had moved forward without anyone noticing, and he was looking at the 2 signatures with an attention that suggested some personal familiarity with the practice of examining documents. "Same person wrote both." "Same hand," Croft confirmed. "Someone forged the signature of a dead man on a federal property inspection document to manufacture a legal basis for seizing a widow's home. That is not a civil matter. That is a felony carrying a federal sentence." Amos let out a long, slow breath from near the door. Callum from the sofa said quietly, "How arrogant do you have to be?" "That's exactly the word," Rex said. "Arrogant. He thinks nobody is looking because he's decided she's alone and old and without the means to look. He miscalculated, Croft said simply, and closed the briefcase for a moment. There is more, he continued. Sheriff Dale Whitmore is Gerald Whitmore's nephew by marriage, which is documented and known. What is considerably less known is that Dale Whitmore's name appears on the incorporation documents of a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Mountain Heritage Holdings. That company received a wire transfer of $240,000 from a subsidiary of Pacific Aqua Corporation 8 months ago. He's not just the nephew, Rex said. He's a partner, Croft said. 15% of whatever Gerald collects flows to Dale through the LLC. The sheriff of Pine Creek has a direct and substantial financial interest in the seizure of this specific property. He is not enforcing the law. He is protecting an investment. Clara had not moved during any of this. She sat in the rocking chair with the shotgun across her lap, and she listened to Barnabas Croft methodically dismantle the apparatus of the thing that had been built to destroy her document by document, and she felt something moving through her that was not quite anger and not quite grief and not quite satisfaction, but contained elements of all three in proportions that shifted as she listened. That dirty, low-down, greedy snake, she said. Her voice was entirely level when she said it, which made it more than if she had shouted. The room was made quieter by it. Clara, Rex said, they'll come tomorrow. Today they tried to freeze you out. Tomorrow they come with the order and the equipment, and they'll try to make it fast before anyone can mount a proper response. I know, Clara said. We need to be ready. I've been ready, she said. Since before you got here. Rex looked at her steadily. There's something you should know, Croft said. He hesitated, which was not something Barnabas Croft did often. He looked at Rex. Rex nodded almost imperceptibly. Croft looked back at Clara. The FBI field office in Denver has been aware of Pacific Aqua Corporation's acquisition practices in the Mountain States for approximately 18 months, he said. There have been irregularities in several other counties. Nothing has risen to the level of a prosecutable case because the paper trails have been carefully managed and the affected property owners have in each case been persuaded or pressured into settlement before the matter reached a stage where federal involvement was warranted. Clara was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. I tell you this, Croft continued, because I want you to understand that what we are dealing with is not an isolated instance of local corruption. This is part of a larger pattern, and the moment we introduce these documents into a public proceeding, this becomes something considerably larger than a Pine Creek property dispute. He paused. Are you prepared for that? Mrs. Jefferson? Clara Mae Jefferson looked at Barnabas Croft. She looked at him the way her father had looked at things he had already decided about, with a settled finality that left no room for the question to come back. My father worked the rails for 11 years to buy this land, she said. My husband spent 41 years making it into a home. I have lived on it for 74 years, and I have kept it, and I have fought for it every way I knew how to fight. She put her hands on the arms of the rocking chair, the chair shaped to fit her exactly. Whatever it takes, she said. That was all. Croft looked at her for a moment with an expression that it was as close to admiration as a man of his professional discipline ever let show. Then he opened his briefcase again and began to organize documents in the specific sequence of a man constructing an argument that was going to be very difficult to dismantle. They worked through the evening. Croft laid out the strategy, and Rex listened, and Clara listened, and Croft answered questions from both of them with the precision of a man who had thought 10 steps ahead of every question before it was asked. The other men came and went, keeping the fire, checking the perimeter of the property at intervals that Clara noticed and did not comment on. Amos made a large pot of chili from what he found in the pantry, and everyone ate it standing because the table was covered in documents. Just before 10 o'clock, with the plan established and the calls made and the documents organized in the sequence they would need them, Rex sat down across from Clara in the chair opposite the rocking chair, Walter's reading chair. He sat in it the way you sit in a chair when you are tired and have been on your feet for a long time. Clara looked at him sitting in Walter's chair and felt something she had not been prepared for. Not grief, particularly, the outline of grief, the particular shape of the space a person leaves. You have children, Rex asked. No, Clara said. We tried. It wasn't meant to be. Rex nodded. Walter sounds like he was a good man, he said. He was the best man I ever knew, Clara said. She looked at the fire. He would have liked you. Rex considered that. Yeah, you're not afraid of work, Clara said, and you stay when it gets hard. She paused. Walter always said you can judge a man by two things, whether he does what he says he'll do and whether he stays. Rex was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. My mother, he said, and then he stopped. Clara waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that some things needed space around them before they came out right. She had a house, he said finally, in Denver. Small place, nothing special, but she had worked 30 years at a school to pay for it. When I was 26, a development company decided they needed the block it sat on, and they ran a condemnation through the city council. He paused. Every piece of paper was in order. Everything they did was technically within the law. He looked at his hands. I couldn't stop it, he said. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't have Croft. I just had anger and no idea what to do with it. He looked up. That was 20 years ago. I've been carrying it ever since. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Well, she said, now you found a place to put it. Rex almost smiled. The closest thing to it she had seen from him. The fire burned down and was built back up. The men found their positions and the cabin settled into the nighttime quiet it had kept for 50 years. Clara lay in her bed looking at the ceiling Walter had built and listening to the cabin's familiar sounds. The wood settling in the cold, the distant wind in the pines, the low voices of the men keeping watch. She was not afraid. The fear was gone, and not in the way fear sometimes retreats temporarily before returning. It was gone the way a debt is gone when it has been paid in full. She had done everything she could do. The letter to Denver was in the mail. Croft was at the table with his documents. Rex Malone and 8 other men were keeping watch through the cold night. She closed her eyes. Down the service road at the far end, where it curved into the pines, a light sat still in the darkness for a long time and then went out. Doyle saw it from the window. He put another log on the fire and went back to his position and said nothing. Morning was coming. Part 3, Justice Wears a Purple Feather. The last hour before dawn is the coldest. Any man who has ever stood a full night's watch in the mountains knows this without being told. The temperature drops one final time in the hour before the sky begins to change, dropping the way a held breath finally releases, and the cold that comes in that last hour has a different quality than the cold of midnight. It is a finishing cold, a cold that means something is ending and something else is about to begin. Rex Malone stood on Clara Jefferson's porch at 5 in the morning and felt that cold working through his thermal shirt, in his vest, in the leather cut he had put back on before dawn, and he watched the eastern sky above the mountain ridge for the first gray suggestion of light. Behind him through the log walls he could hear the cabin waking. Amos was at the stove. The smell of coffee and something savory moved through the gap under the door. Callum was up, his ankle wrapped tight, moving with a limp he was working hard to minimize. Doyle was at the window that faced the service road where he had been for most of the night, watching with the steady patience of a man who had learned that the most important things appeared when you stopped straining to see them. Croft had slept on the sofa in his cashmere overcoat briefcase on the floor beside him, with one hand resting on the handle, and he had been awake before Rex, sitting up in the dark reviewing documents by flashlight, with the focused concentration of a man running through arguments he had already built and could not stop refining. Clara's door opened at 5:30. She came out dressed, not in her housecoat or her robe. She was dressed in the clothes she wore to church on the Sundays when the weather was good enough to make the drive down the mountain. A dark wool skirt and a white blouse with a cameo pin at the collar that had belonged to her mother. Good shoes, the ones she polished and kept in the box on the closet shelf. And on her head, at an angle that made clear she had given the matter thought, a hat with a purple feather that curved down along the left side of the brim. She stood in the doorway of her bedroom and looked at the room full of men. The men looked back at her. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Amos said quietly and with complete sincerity, "Miss Clara, you look like someone the devil himself would think twice about." Clara smoothed the front of her skirt. "Sit down and eat," she said. "We have a long morning." They ate at the table and on the floor, and standing at the counter, 8 men and a lawyer and a 74-year-old woman in her Sunday clothes, and the meal was eggs and toast and the last of the bacon and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Nobody spoke much because there was not much left to say. The plan was made. The documents were organized in Croft's briefcase in the precise sequence they would need. The calls that needed to be made had been made the previous evening, and the people on the other end of those calls had said what they needed to say. At 7:15, Clara went to the window. She stood there for a moment looking out at her land. The snow from the blizzard covered everything deep and brilliant white in the early light, and the pine trees on the north slope carried their loads of snow on every branch, and the mountains behind it all were clear and enormous and permanent in the way mountains are permanent, which is to say they had been there before any of this began and would be there long after. Walter, she said very quietly. Not a prayer exactly, not quite a conversation, just his name, the way you say the name of someone who is not in the room but has never entirely left it. She turned back to the room. Let's go, she said. The Pine Creek Town Hall was a converted gymnasium attached to the elementary school on the main road through town, a building that smelled of floor wax and old coffee, and the particular institutional quality of a space that had absorbed decades of human gathering. The folding chairs were the same ones that had been there since 1978. The fluorescent light still buzzed at a frequency that gave susceptible people headaches. The stage at the far end still carried the painted forest backdrop from the school's last theatrical production that nobody had gotten around to removing. By 8:30 in the morning, it was packed to the walls. Gerald Whitmore had been thorough, and he had been busy. The story that had moved through Pine Creek in the previous 24 hours was a story of crisis. An elderly woman, possibly not in full command of her faculties, had been taken over by a group of dangerous transients, members of a notorious motorcycle club. The sheriff had attempted to execute a lawful order and had been met with threats and turned away. The situation had deteriorated. The community needed to act before it got worse. Pine Creek was a small town, and small towns ran on narrative on the story currently moving from household to household. And Gerald Whitmore understood this the way he understood most useful things about human nature as a mechanism to be operated. He had put the right words in the right ears, and the story had done what stories do in small towns. It had grown. It had shed its complications and become the story people already knew how to feel about innocent woman in danger threatening outsiders' community under siege. 230 people in that gymnasium were frightened and angry and certain, which is always the most dangerous combination. Whitmore stood at the podium in his best dark charcoal suit, the one he wore when he needed people to feel they were in the presence of serious authority. Sheriff Dale Whitmore stood behind him to the right in full uniform hat, in his hands expression arranged to project controlled concern. 3 town council members sat at a table to the left, also in good clothes, also with expressions of controlled concern. The television camera from the regional news station in Colorado Springs was set up at the back of the room. Whitmore had called them the previous day. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone, and the buzzing in the room subsided into attention. We are facing a situation this morning that demands our collective response. One of our own, Clara Mae Jefferson, a widow and a longtime member of this community, is being held on her property against her will by individuals who have demonstrated their willingness to use force against lawful authority. The room murmured. Someone near the front said, "Shame on them. The county holds a legitimate and properly issued legal order." Whitmore continued. The Jefferson property has been professionally assessed and condemned for reasons of documented public safety. We have attempted to execute this order humanely and responsibly. We have been met with threats and obstruction. He paused, letting the room absorb it. I am asking this council today to authorize whatever force is necessary to resolve this situation, to remove the individuals unlawfully occupying that property, and to ensure the safety of Clara Jefferson and the people of this community. He looked out at the room with the expression of a man who wanted nothing more than peace and was prepared to do what difficult circumstances required of him. He was very good at this expression. He had been practicing it for 20 years. The council members were nodding. The room was nodding. The television camera was running. Everything was proceeding according to the plan Gerald Whitmore had been constructing for 18 months, the plan that ended with 47 acres of mountain land in county hands and $40 million flowing toward a Cayman Islands account registered in a name that traced back to him through 3 layers of corporate structure. He was drawing breath to continue when the doors at the back of the gymnasium opened. The sound they made was not dramatic. They were the same hollow core gymnasium doors they had always been opening, with the ordinary clunk of a push bar being engaged and the rush of cold air from outside. Not a dramatic sound at all. But the room turned. It turned the way rooms turn when the thing that changes the weight of a space occurs, when what everyone was oriented toward is suddenly no longer the most important thing present. Clara Mae Jefferson walked through those doors. She walked the way she had walked all her life, straight-spined and deliberate, each step placed with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to navigate icy mountain paths and did not intend to fall. She was small. She was 74 years old. She was wearing her Sunday clothes and her mother's cameo and her hat with the purple feather, and she walked down the center aisle of the Pine Creek Town Hall Gymnasium with her hand resting lightly on the arm of a very large man in a navy suit, and she looked at the 230 people in that room with the eyes of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was not going to waste a second of it. Behind her came 8 men. They were not wearing leather. They were wearing button-down shirts in varying degrees of fit and slacks and dress shoes that in several cases had clearly been purchased that morning from the general merchandise store on Route 9. Callum was wearing a blue Oxford slightly too large in the shoulders. Amos's dress shirt, the largest size available, was doing serious structural work across the chest. Doyle had found a bolo tie somewhere and had committed to it completely. They did not look like the photographs the news used when it ran stories about motorcycle clubs. They looked like the biggest, most weathered church choir in the recorded history of Colorado. And beside Clara on her other side walked Barnabas Croft in his cashmere overcoat, carrying his briefcase. The room was absolutely still. Gerald Whitmore stood at the podium and watched Clara Mae Jefferson walk toward him down the center aisle of his carefully arranged proceeding and felt for the first time in 18 months the specific cold sensation of a plan beginning to come apart. "She looks fine," someone near the back of the room said. The words moved through the crowd like a current. Someone else. "That's Clara. I thought they said she was... She doesn't look like she needs saving." Clara walked to the stage stairs. She climbed them without assistance, though Rex's hand was ready at her elbow present, without being intrusive, and she crossed the stage and stood at the podium and looked at Gerald Whitmore directly. Whitmore, to his credit, did not step back. He was a man who had survived 2 decades in politics by maintaining composure under circumstances that would have broken less practiced performers. He kept his expression composed and his voice calibrated. "Mrs. Jefferson," he said into the microphone, "we were just discussing your situation. I'm so relieved to see that your..." Clara put her hand on the microphone. She did not snatch it or push him aside. She simply placed her hand on it with the authority of a woman in her own house, redirecting a guest who had talked long enough, and Whitmore, through pure social reflex, stopped talking. Clara looked out at the room. "This man," she said, "told you my house was falling down." Her voice carried without effort. It was the voice of a woman who had spent decades calling across mountain distances, a voice that knew how to travel and find its destination. "He told you I was losing my mind. He told you these men were holding me against my will and that I needed to be rescued." She let the room hold that for a moment. But when the blizzard hit, she said, "When the power went out and the roads washed out and the temperature dropped to 12 below, where was Gerald Whitmore?" The room was silent. "He was in his warm house," Clara said, "with his good fireplace and his good whiskey, while I was alone on a mountain in a blizzard with a broken pipe and an eviction notice on my table." She looked at the men arranged across the front of the gymnasium. "These men came to my door in that storm," she said, "not to threaten me, not to take anything that belonged to me. They came because their road was gone and I offered them shelter, and they repaid that shelter by fixing my roof and shoring up my foundation and cooking my breakfast and standing between me and the people who wanted to drag me out of my home in the middle of winter." She looked back at the room. "Gerald Whitmore wants you to be afraid of them," she said, "because as long as you're looking at them, you're not looking at him." She stepped back from the podium. Barnabas Croft moved. He crossed the stage with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this many times in many rooms and had learned that speed and calm in combination creates something very difficult to interrupt. He set 2 documents on the table in front of the council members and held a third up so the room could see. "My name is Barnabas Croft," he said. "I am an attorney licensed in the states of Illinois, Colorado, and 4 others. I have been retained by Mrs. Jefferson in connection with the condemnation order issued against her property." He held up the first document. "This is a wire transfer record," he said, "dated 11 months ago. A sum of $240,000 was transferred from a subsidiary of Pacific Aqua Corporation, a California-based water extraction company, to a Delaware LLC called Mountain Heritage Holdings. The sole managing member of Mountain Heritage Holdings is Sheriff Dale Whitmore. The room erupted, not all at once, but in a wave starting near the front, where people could read Croft's certainty in his face and posture moving backward through the room as the information reached people, and they turned to their neighbors, and the sound built into something that pressed against the walls of the gymnasium. Dale Whitmore in his uniform and his hat and his carefully arranged expression went the color of old chalk. Croft waited. He was practiced at waiting. He held up the second document. This is the inspection report that generated the condemnation order against the Jefferson property, he said. It bears the signature of a licensed structural inspector in the state of Colorado named Franklin Dawson. He reached into the briefcase and produced a third document. He held both up simultaneously so the council members at their table could see them side by side. This is Franklin Dawson's death certificate, he said. Mr. Dawson died of cardiac arrest in Denver 14 months ago. He did not inspect this property. He did not sign this report. Someone forged his signature on a federal inspection document to manufacture a legal basis for seizing a widow's home and the land beneath it. He set both documents on the table in front of the council. Forging a federal inspection document is a felony, Croft said. Conspiracy to commit property fraud is a felony. Using a public office to advance a direct personal financial interest is a felony. The evidence I have presented has already been forwarded to the FBI field office in Denver. The room had gone beyond noise into something more fundamental, a sustained collective sound that was past words, the sound of 200 people simultaneously revising their understanding of what was true. Gerald Whitmore moved. He came across the stage faster than a man in a charcoal suit should have been able to, his hand outstretched toward the documents on the council table, his face stripped of every layer of the performance he had spent years constructing. What was underneath was not something more appealing. "Give me those," he said, and his voice had lost everything smooth about it. Amos Webb stepped in front of the council table. He did not reach for Whitmore. He did not raise his hands. He simply moved from where he was standing to where Whitmore needed to go and stood there, and the laws of physics did the rest. Whitmore hit him at full stride and rebounded. There was no other word for it. He came back off Amos and stumbled, sideways arms windmilling, fighting for balance at the edge of the stage. Doyle Burkett's foot was there. It was a quiet extension of 1 foot a few inches in a particular direction, the kind of thing a man with quick reflexes and a certain dry sense of humor might accomplish without appearing to do anything at all. Whitmore's leading foot caught it, and his trailing foot had nowhere to recover to, and he went down. He hit the gymnasium floor face first in front of 230 voters and a television camera from Colorado Springs, and the sound he made was not a sound that a man in a charcoal suit should make in public, and the laughter from the room was not the kind laughter. Clara looked down at Gerald Whitmore on the floor. She had known this man for 9 years. She had watched him stand at podiums and shake hands and arrange his face into shapes that meant sincerity or gravity or concern, whichever the occasion required. She had watched him the way you watch someone who wants something you have, with the steady attention of a woman who has learned that what people want tells you more about them than anything they say. He looked up at her from the gymnasium floor, and even then, even in that moment, the calculation tried to reassemble itself in his face. The reflex of a man who was always looking for the angle. "There is no angle here," Gerald Clara said. She was not angry when she said it. She was tired in the specific way you are tired when something that has required enormous sustained effort is finally conclusively finished. The doors at the back of the gymnasium opened again. These opened differently. They opened with the particular authority of people accustomed to doors opening for them, and the 4 people who came through wore the specific clothing and carried themselves with the specific bearing of federal agents arriving at a place where federal authority had been requested and was now being exercised. The room parted for them the way rooms always do. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and the expression of someone who had made a long drive and was ready to complete her morning's work. She walked to the council table and examined the documents Croft had laid out. She looked at them carefully. Then she looked at Croft. "Mr. Croft," she said. Agent Mercer Croft said, "I believe you have something for us." "I believe I have several things for you," Croft said. He picked up the briefcase. Agent Mercer paused. She turned back and looked at Clara directly. Not with the look people give elderly women they have come to rescue, but with the look you give someone you have been waiting to meet. Mrs. Jefferson, she said, I want you to know something. 3 months ago, a package arrived at our Denver field office. Certified mail, return address Pine Creek, Colorado. It contained a property survey, a copy of the Pacific Aqua Acquisition Inquiry, filed with the Water Rights Board copies of county meeting records going back 4 years, and a handwritten summary of Gerald Whitmore's conduct that was frankly one of the most thorough and well-organized pieces of preliminary documentation I have received in 21 years of federal service. She paused. That package came from you. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Agent Mercer with an expression that gave nothing away and everything at once. I've been watching that man for 4 years, Clara said. I just needed someone with the authority to do something about what I was watching. Rex looked at her. She looked back at him without apology and without anything performative about the moment. You called Croft, she said. I called Denver. We both made our calls. Rex was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had something in it that had not been there before. How long have you been planning this? He asked. Clara smoothed the front of her skirt. Since the day that check arrived in the envelope, with the condemnation notice, she said. A man who tries to buy what he plans to take anyway tells you exactly what kind of man he is and exactly how afraid he is of you. I just made sure the right people were paying attention when he showed everyone who he was. She stepped off the stage without waiting for a response. The men who had come to this gymnasium believing they were there to support a woman in need understood in that moment that they had not come to support her at all. They had been the visible portion of a plan she had already made and set in motion. The storm she had called, perhaps without knowing she was calling it on the night she stood in the blizzard with a lantern and decided what kind of woman she was going to be about what was coming for her. Dale Whitmore sat down on the nearest folding chair and put his hat on his knee and did the mathematics available to him and waited. It did not take long. Gerald Whitmore was helped to his feet by two of the agents. His charcoal suit had a scuff on the knee, and his composure was entirely gone, replaced by something smaller and more honest. He looked at the room of people who had come to his meeting and saw in their faces the specific expression of an audience that has watched a performance and understood too late who was performing what. He looked at Clara. This isn't over, he said. His voice had recovered some of its smoothness out of pure habit. The law's on my side. Clara looked at him. The law, she said, and her voice was clear and reached every corner of that gymnasium without effort. Maybe. She let the words stand there. But justice is mine. They took Jerry Whitmore out of the Pine Creek Town Hall in handcuffs at 9:47 in the morning, and they took Dale Whitmore out 7 minutes later, and the television camera from Colorado Springs recorded both exits, and the recording ran on the regional news that evening and was picked up by the national feed by the following morning. And the story that ran was not the story Gerald Whitmore had spent 18 months constructing. Rex was beside Clara when the doors closed behind the federal agents. He looked at her. She was looking at the doors with the expression of a woman setting something down that she had been carrying for a long time. Clara, he said quietly. She turned. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, told you. Clara looked at him. Told me what she said. That bullies count on their victims being alone. Clara was quiet. I was never entirely alone, she said. I had Walter's house and my father's land and 74 years of knowing exactly what I was standing on. She looked at Rex. You just made it harder for them to pretend otherwise. The men stayed one more day. Clara had expected them to leave that afternoon after the handcuffs and the television camera and all the machinery of consequence Croft had set in motion. She had expected them to go to Utah to the funeral they had been trying to reach when the blizzard caught them back to whatever lives they lived in the spaces between. Instead, they stayed. They split wood in the afternoon until there was enough stacked against the north wall of the cabin to see through 3 hard winters. Amos repacked the firewood shed with the methodical precision of someone building something meant to endure. Doyle repaired the gutter on the east side that had been pulling away from the fascia since the previous summer. Callum, under firm instructions to keep his ankle elevated, sat on the porch and sorted hardware from Walter's old toolbox, organizing nails and screws and bolts by size into labeled mason jars, with a seriousness that suggested he found the work genuinely satisfying. Rex spent the afternoon under the cabin again, checking the previous day's work, adding brackets in two places where the wood had aged. By evening, the cabin was in better structural condition than it had been in 15 years. At dusk, they gathered on the porch. The mountains were doing what they did at dusk in winter, turning colors that had no exact names in any standard vocabulary, the pink and the amber and the particular shade of purple-gray that came in the last minutes before the cold, dark settled in for the night. The valley below was already in shadow. Up here on the mountain, the last light held a little longer the way it always did. Clara stood at the porch railing and looked at her land. She looked at the meadow where the aquifer ran deep under the snow, the meadow her father had walked when he first came to see what he had purchased with 11 years of his life. She looked at the pine grove where Walter had built the bench so she could sit and watch the mountains come alive in the mornings. She looked at the mountains themselves and the sky going dark above them, and she thought that Elias Dupree standing on this land in 1930 with his $40 spent and 47 acres under his feet would have found this week satisfactory. All things considered. Rex came and stood beside her at the railing. They stood without talking for a while, which was easy with Rexon, the silence between them undemanding. He was a man who did not fill silence for the sake of filling it, which was a quality Clara had always associated with people who were settled in themselves. Rex reached into his vest and held something in his palm before he spoke. "Clara," he said, "there's something we do in the club when we find someone who deserves to be looked after by us." He paused. "We don't do it often. It isn't given lightly." He opened his hand. It was a patch, small the size of a playing card dark fabric. On it, embroidered in red thread, a heart with a dagger through it. Simple. Nothing like the elaborate insignia on their cuts. "It means this property is a sanctioned stop," Rex said. "Any rider anywhere sees this on your door. They know this place is under protection. They know who to contact if something goes wrong here." He looked at her. "And it means your family. Our kind of family, which I understand is an unusual thing to offer and maybe a strange thing to receive." Clara looked at the patch in his palm. She thought about a night 3 days ago when she had stood on these porch steps in a blizzard with a kerosene lantern and made a decision about what kind of woman she was going to be about the freezing men on her road. She thought about Walter's voice in her head, clear as a struck bell. She thought about the check burning in the grate and the envelope on its way to Denver and everything that had followed from those two acts. She held out her hand. Rex placed the patch in her palm. He took a pin from his vest pocket and pinned it carefully to the lapel of her Sunday coat, the coat she had put on that morning when she decided what kind of morning it was going to be. He stepped back. "For life," he said. Clara touched the patch with her fingertips. It was heavier than it looked. Things that meant something usually were. Amos appeared in the doorway behind them, filling it the way he filled most doorways completely. "Miss Clara," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who had been working up to something and had finally decided to say it. "We were thinking," he looked at the mountains and then back at her, "if it's all right with you, could we come back next winter?" He looked at his boots for a moment. "We'd bring the shovels," he said. Clara looked at Amos Webb, at his enormous tattooed hands, in his bald head, in his face that had clearly been through things she was glad she had not been required to go through. And she thought about him standing at her stove in Walter's apron making blueberry pancakes with his grandmother's recipe. The grandmother who had taught him in Alabama that you judge a man by whether he pays attention to the small things. "You bring the shovels," she said. "I'll have the syrup ready." The 9 men left the next morning. They went down the service road and onto the mountain highway, 9 Harley-Davidsons, in the gray, early light exhaust rising in white plumes in the cold air. The snow from the blizzard was beginning to melt where the sun reached the road, and the valley below was visible for the first time in 3 days, laid out in the brilliant clarity that comes after a storm has passed and washed the air clean. Clara stood on the porch and watched them go. Rex was last. He stopped at the end of the service road where it met the highway and looked back at the cabin. Clara was a small figure on the porch. A slight woman in a coat with a patch on the lapel, standing on the land her father had bought and her husband had loved, and 3 men had tried to take from her and failed. Rex raised his fist. Clara raised her hand. He turned onto the highway and was gone. The silence came back, but it was not the same silence that had occupied this cabin before the blizzard. That silence had been the silence of a woman alone with her memories and her determination in the long quiet of a house where someone used to be. This silence had something different in it, something that had not been present before. Clara went inside and sat in Walter's rocking chair and put her hand on the arm where his hands had worn the wood smooth over 41 years, and she looked at the fireplace and listened to the cabin settling around her in the morning cold. She was still here. The land was still here. The years that followed became their own kind of story, the sort that accumulates slowly and is only visible as a whole when you step back far enough to see the entire shape of it. The December after the blizzard, the sound of motorcycle engines came again to Pine Creek. Not 9 this time, 50. They came down, wrote 9 in a column that the locals heard long before they saw it, and they brought turkeys and Christmas trees strapped to their handlebars and boxes of toys for the children's home in town. They brought a professional-grade generator for Clara and Amos, installed it in an afternoon, while Clara fed everyone cornbread and chili. The year after that, more came. 80, then more still. By 2005, it had a name. The Clara Run, the town of Pine Creek, which had once watched from behind curtain windows while 9 bikers drove up the mountain road, now marked the date on community calendars. The diner prepped extra pies the week before. The gas station brought in additional fuel. The elementary school started a project where the children made cards to give to the riders when they came through, and the riders kept those cards, and several of them were found on the persons of men at funerals, years later worn soft from being carried. The world, it turned out, was capable of revising itself. It only needed a sufficient reason. In the summer of 2003, 3 men came up the mountain road after dark and broke the lock on Walter's hay barn. They were looking for tools or equipment or whatever the barn might contain worth carrying off. Clara heard them from the house and put on her coat and walked to the barn and opened the door and turned on the light. On the wall, on a piece of oak board that Rex had sealed with varnish and nailed up 6 years earlier, was a sign hand-lettered in black paint. It read, "This property protected by Hell's Riders, MC. Trespassers will regret the decision." The 3 men laughed. They stopped laughing when they heard the engine. It was a single motorcycle idling at the far end of the service road. Not moving, just present, a young man on a Harley, a prospect named Egan, who had been assigned to the Pine Creek watch rotation for the month, sitting in the dark at the end of the road with his headlight on, looking at the barn with the patient attention of someone who had been told what his job was and understood it clearly. He did not come up the road. He did not have to. The 3 men left with such urgency that they forgot the bolt cutters they had brought with them. Clara found them in the morning and put them in the barn to use for something useful, which Walter would have done. The chapter rotated prospects through the Pine Creek area on a schedule that Clara was not precisely informed of and did not ask about. She noticed over the years when someone new was doing it and when someone she recognized came back, and she left coffee on the porch railing on cold nights, and in the morning the coffee was gone and the cup was rinsed and turned upside down beside the railing. In the spring of 2007, Callum Hess came up the mountain road in a truck instead of on a motorcycle, which was how Clara knew something was different before he got out of the vehicle. He was 35 years old, and he had a woman with him, small and dark-haired and watchful in the specific way of someone who has learned that paying attention is a form of protection, and he had a bundle in his arms that he carried with the particular terrified care of a man holding something he is not yet fully confident he deserves to hold. He brought the baby up to the porch and placed her in Clara's arms. "Her name is Clara," he said. "Clara May Hess." Clara held the baby and looked at Callum, at the young man who had lain on her sofa with a sprained ankle on the worst night of his life, looking up at her with his young face full of something that wanted to be hope. The young man who had nowhere to go before he had somewhere to go. "She's beautiful," Clara said. "She has your ears, which you should probably apologize to her for at some point." Callum laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is genuinely uncomplicated happy, and Clara thought that was one of the best sounds she had heard in some time. Doyle Burkett died in the spring of 2010. It was cancer, the slow and systematic kind that announces itself early and does not hurry. He had known about it for 2 years before anyone outside the club knew, because Doyle had been private about most things, and his dying was no exception to that. He rode until he could not, and then he stopped riding and moved into a house near the Denver chapter and received visitors until that was no longer practical, and Rex was with him at the end. 2 weeks before he died, Doyle wrote letters, one to Rex, one to his sister in Montana, one to Clara Jefferson in Pine Creek, Colorado. Clara read hers at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in April with the windows open and the smell of spring coming in off the mountain, the particular smell of snowmelt and pine, and the first earth of the season. The letter was not long. Doyle was not a man who had spent his life practicing the expression of himself on paper, and the effort showed in the careful block letters, but not in a way that diminished anything. It read, Mrs. Jefferson, I am not good at saying things the right way, but I want you to know that the night we came to your door was the best thing that happened to me in a long time. You were not afraid of us, and you were not nice to us the way people are nice when they want something from you. You were just decent. You treated us like men worth being decent to. I have thought about that a lot. You were the first person outside the club who ever made me feel like a human being in a long time, and I am grateful to you for that more than I know how to say. Doyle Burkett. Clara read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept the things she intended to keep, always the box with Walter's letters from before they were married, and her father's rail company identification card, and her mother's cameo, and the photographs of people she had loved. She kept Doyle Burkett's letter in that box until the day she died. The winters passed, the cabin held, Clara held. She was made of the same materials the foundation Walter had laid, the kind that takes the pressure in over time and becomes denser and more permanent for it, the kind that does not give way when it is tested, but reveals what it has always been made of. Rex came every December with the run and stayed an extra day to walk the property and check the structure, doing it the way he did most things quietly and without making a production of the doing. His hair went gray and then white. The lines in his face accumulated into the particular topography of a man who has carried significant things for a long time and has not put them down. He became chapter president in 2004 and wore that the same way he wore everything else important without ceremony. He and Clara sat by the fire every December and talked about Walter and about the land and about the things Rex had seen in the years since the blizzard, and sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that only happens between people who have been through something together and emerged on the other side trusting each other with silence. The winter of 2014 came in hard. Clara was 91 years old. The rocking chair moved more slowly now. The mornings took longer than they used to. Her mind was clear and her eyes were still sharp, but her body had arrived at its own conclusions and was moving steadily in a direction she understood with the equanimity of a woman who had spent her life in mountain country where everything that lived eventually returned to the ground, and the ground was not something to be afraid of. Rex had arranged the nursing team the previous year, 2 women who rotated through the week, staying in the cabin, so Clara would not have to leave it. She had agreed to this with only minor argument, which Rex understood as more significant than if she had agreed easily. She wanted to be in the cabin. She wanted to die in the bed Walter had built in the house her father had made on the land that Elias Dupree had bought with the wages of his own labor and his own indomitable will to own something that was genuinely his. The nurse called Rex on a Tuesday afternoon in February. It's time, she said. He was on the road within the hour. He did not put it on the radio or on any network with a public face. He used the wire, the old informal system that ran underneath the official world of the club, the word of mouth and phone call and message passed hand to hand that had connected the chapters since before any of the current members were old enough to ride. The message was 5 words. The matriarch is going home. By the time Rex reached Pine Creek, the highway was already beginning to fill. Clara Mae Jefferson died that Tuesday night in February of 2014 in the bed Walter Jefferson had built in the autumn of 1953, in the room where she had been born, in the winter of 1923, in the house that her father had built with his own hands, on the land he had purchased with the wages of 11 years on the rails, because he wanted something that was his and could not be taken from him. She died looking at the mountains through the window Walter had framed for her. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. The church in Pine Creek held 100 people if they sat close together. The pastor had been quietly concerned about attendance because Clara had outlived most of the people who had known her longest, and the ones who remained were old, and February roads in the Colorado mountains were not easy. By 7 in the morning, the highway patrol had closed Interstate 70. By 8, the column stretched past any point from which the end of it was visible. They came from California and Utah and Wyoming and Nebraska and from states further than those. They came alone and in groups and in full chapter formations, riding with a tight precision of people who had been doing this together for a long time. The sound they made was continuous, filling the valley and bouncing back off the mountain faces, changed and layered into something that had not been heard in this part of Colorado before. 3,000 motorcycles, Hell's Riders, Bandoleros, Iron Wolves, Pagans. Clubs that had been active enemies for 30 years rode side by side with their flags lowered because the woman they had come for had never concerned herself with the differences between them, and they were not going to dishonor her memory by making those differences matter now. Respect recognizes respect. It crosses whatever lines you draw to find its counterpart. The procession was 5 miles long. Pine Creek stood on its porches and its sidewalks and watched them come, the whole town. The people who had been there in 1997 and the people who had arrived since, the children who had grown up. Hearing the story of the blizzard, the way children in Pine Creek grew up hearing it, which is to say, knowing that the woman on the mountain had never been someone to feel sorry for or only proud of. At the cemetery, the crowd spread over the hill and down the other side. Rex Malone stood at the edge of the grave in his cut, the president patch weathered and soft from years of constant wearing. He had considered wearing a suit and had decided against it. He had worn his cut to every important thing in his life for 25 years, and this was the most important thing, and he was going to wear it. He had not prepared anything to say because there was nothing he could say that was sufficient to what he was thinking. And he had spent 2 days trying to find those words, and they had not come, and he had understood finally that the words were not the point. They had never been the point. He reached into the inside pocket of his cut. The paper was soft from years of being folded and unfolded. He had looked at it many times, not out of triumph, but out of something harder to name, the need to verify that the night in the blizzard was real, that the woman who had opened her door and fed them stew and told them to take their boots off was real and had been real all these years. The condemnation order. Gerald Whitmore's signature at the bottom. The deadline of December 15, 1997, circled in red ink. Whitmore had served 7 years in federal prison. The charges had included forgery of federal documents, conspiracy to commit property fraud, and multiple counts of abuse of public office. Pacific Aqua Corporation had settled with the Colorado Water Rights Board and withdrawn entirely from operations in the state. Dale Whitmore had lost his badge and his freedom for 4 years and everything else of value not long after. The Jefferson property remained as it had always been on the land that Elias Dupree had made his. Rex looked at the paper one final time. He placed it on the casket. He reached into his other pocket and took out a white rose, the only kind the Pine Creek florist had in stock that morning, and placed it beside the letter. He stood with his hand resting on the casket for a moment. "Ride easy, Ma," he said. "We got the watch from here." 3,000 engines started. Not simultaneously, but in a wave, the way the sound had built when they arrived, finding its rhythm, growing from a few to many, to something that was no longer individual machines, but a single collective voice. A sound that filled the valley from one wall to the other and rose up the mountain faces and scattered snow from the high branches and traveled outward in all directions until there was no place in Pine Creek where you could not feel it moving through you. It was not noise. Noise is what happens when sound has no intention behind it. This had intention. This was 3,000 people saying a name, saying it in the only language they knew that was adequate to what they meant, in the idiom of the engine and the road and the miles that accumulate into a life and a loyalty and a promise made in a blizzard that was never going to be retracted. Saying thank you and goodbye, and we remember, and we were changed by knowing you, and we will not forget. It was the loudest prayer ever offered in the Rocky Mountains. It shook the windows of every house in Pine Creek. It moved through the frozen ground. It lasted a long time. The cabin is still there. It stands on 47 acres of mountain land outside Pine Creek, Colorado, on the land that Elias Dupree purchased in 1930 with cash he had saved over 11 years on the rails, the land his daughter kept for 74 years against everything that tried to take it from her. No developer has come to claim it since. The legal status of the property is a matter of complete public record, and the community of people who care about it is not one that anyone in the business of acquisition has found it practical to challenge. The garden is tended by a rotating group of people from town who took it on after Clara died and have not stopped. The roof is sound, the porch is solid. The rocking chair sits beside the fireplace in the place it has always occupied, shaped to fit a woman who no longer needs it and will not be sitting in it again and is present in it nonetheless. There is a bronze plaque on the front wall beside the door. It was placed there by an anonymous trust administered out of the Chicago, and if you pressed Barnabas Croft about it, he would neither confirm nor deny his involvement, which was itself a sufficient confirmation for those who understood how Croft operated. The plaque does not list dates. It does not list accomplishments or positions held or awards received. It says, Clara Mae Jefferson. She offered shelter to the storm, and the storm became her shield. On cold winter nights in Pine Creek, when the wind comes down off the mountain, the way it came down in December of 1997, and the temperature drops hard and the snow comes sideways, the people who live in the valley below will sometimes hear something that might be the wind finding the gaps in the tree line, or might be something else entirely. A low rumble, moving, circling the property line with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has made a commitment and intends to keep it regardless of the weather or the hour, or how many years have passed since the commitment was made. The locals know what it is. They have known for a long time. They turn over in their warm beds, or they stand at their windows and look up toward the mountain, and they feel the vibration in their chests, and they settle back into sleep without fear, because they know exactly what the sound means and exactly who it is for. It means the watch is kept. It means the promise made in a blizzard in the winter of 1997 by a woman with a lantern and 9 men who stayed was not the kind of promise that has an expiration date. It means that somewhere up on that mountain on the land, a railroad man bought with the wages of his labor, and that his daughter held for 74 years against everything that tried to take it, the storm that came to destroy, has been standing guard instead. As it always will.